All right, boy, am I excited for this. A lot of news when it comes down to the National Association of Realtors, lawsuits, buyer broker agreements. How in the heck are we going to get paid? So we're really lucky to have in studio my designated broker from West USA Realty, Duane Fouts. We are here in the great state of Arizona, Duane. We have no earthquakes. We have no blizzards. We have no tornadoes. This is Arizona.
This is the place to be. I would agree.
All right. So the other day or last week, the National Association of Realtors reached an agreement in principle because this is a proposal from the National Association of Realtors to, well, take care of this lawsuit. But what I'd like for you to do real quick is take us back in time to the impetus of this lawsuit. Where is this coming from,
Sure.
and why are we here today?
Okay. Yeah, I can do that. This lawsuit all started about 4 years ago, maybe a little more, 2019, I guess. It stems from the NAR's rules regarding participation in the local MLSs around the country. This case that we're talking about mostly right now was the one out of Missouri called the Seitzer case, and it went to trial in October of this year, finally, a 2-week trial or thereabouts. And we had the jury go out for 3 hours and some odd minutes and come back with a $1.7 billion judgment in favor of the plaintiffs. So that shook our world, and here we are today.
So here we are today. When I look at this this notification or notice from the National Association of Realtors, at the end of the day, they are willing to pay or agreeing to pay $418 million over approximately 4 years. I know your phone has been ringing off the hook.
Yep.
And there's a lot of people out there that are pointing the fingers at NAR, saying that they rolled over. Are they the bad guy here? They're coming out and saying that they are protecting us. Explain that, because I think just a lot of agents are caught up in the emotion of this, and I'm not going to say confused. Oh, maybe I will say confused.
There's a lot of moving parts on this thing going on, and I know that I have a lot of confidence in our NAR leadership, in our NAR executives, in our attorneys. Yes, there is a lot of confusion out there as to what this is going to mean to our industry. But at the end of the day, I believe that our representatives at the NAR level and their attorneys did the very, very best they could do to resolve this dispute. Is it pretty? It depends on how you look at it, but they
their backs are against the wall on this.
They're absolutely
regardless
against the
of
wall.
who put them there. Their backs are against, and our backs are against
Yes,
the wall here.
all of us, our backs are against the wall, and like it or not, this is the way our legal system works in our great United States, and so we have to figure out a way to move through this. And do I think that they rolled over? No. At the end of the day, I don't think so.
Yeah, and I would say, I know you're very heavily involved, and important people at
Sure.
NAR. We have, we're just getting headlines here. I mean, I haven't read any legal briefs. I depend on our brokers to do that, and their attorneys to do that to make heads and tails of it for me. And I think with that being said, because we're getting our news from Facebook,
Unfortunately.
And so I don't know if we have the accurate picture of NAR and what they've been doing to protect us moving forward.
A lot of it is clickbait, right, out there on the internet, social media. It's not the story that's being brought forward, and so yeah, I totally agree with you. I don't think that there's the whole thing is still. We're all trying to get our arms wrapped around it. I mean, we have been in it, but we haven't been in it, if you know what I mean, from the standpoint of how those lawyers have been dealing with the settlement proposals.
All right. I want to discuss basically two things that that jump out at me at this proposal. It's important to note that it is simply a proposal right now. It needs
Correct.
to go through additional legal channels. So I'm just going to jump into it, and I'm just going to read it verbatim from the notice that the National Association of Realtors sent everybody. NAR has agreed to put in place a new MLS rule prohibiting offers of broker compensation on the MLS. This would mean that offers of broker compensation could not be communicated via the MLS, but they could continue to be an option consumers pursue off MLS through negotiation and consultation with real estate professionals. A lot of agents read this right away going, okay, there is no path for me to represent buyers and get paid. There is a path, but break down and if this all passes, we're expecting these changes to take effect sometime in the middle of July 2024. What are the do's and the don'ts? If this passed today, if this became law today, what are the do's and don'ts as far as the MLS goes?
Well, first of all, you are exactly right. This is not something that is done yet. It is a proposed settlement. It still has to go through the judge's approval and some other legal hurdles. So there is processes that are going to have to take place. But let's make an assumption that it is going to happen, right? That this will get approved in its form. From the standpoint of compensation, no. I mean, we're still going to be able to get compensated as buyers agents. It's just how that looks. There's still a lot of moving pieces. I'm not 100% sure what that looks like, but I envision the idea that agents are going to be now having communication about compensation. My guess is there'll be additional documentation that is going to be required between the brokerages of those agents in order to validate and ensure that that compensation happens. I also envision that there's going to be negotiations between buyers and sellers over compensation because another part of this that we're going to get to is about the buyer-broker exclusive employment agreement, right? So part of the plaintiff's desire in this whole thing was to get the buyer and the seller to start negotiating compensation in their agreements. And so I see that coming as a way too.
So in essence, moving forward, if this thing passes as is, there will, as a buyer's agent, no place on the MLS listing that would indicate to me that there is buyer-broker compensation on the table, nor how much that buyer-broker compensation is. And as a listing agent, there is no way through the MLS to advertise and let a buyer's agent know, yes, my seller is willing to pay a buyer-broker commission.
As this stands right now, that would be true with a caveat. There is a provision in here that would allow a seller to offer concessions to the buyer. They cannot dictate how those concessions are used, but they can offer concessions that are negotiable on the purchase contract and their offering.
Would that potentially be something that we could indicate in the listing?
On the MLS?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
That's where it's kind of headed. I listened to the attorney for the California Regional Multiple Listing Service recently, and they are working on a solution that would allow a field in the MLS to indicate what sellers may be willing to offer for concessions to the buyers.
But in that probably, and I know this is just conjecture now, we're kind of guessing, but we might potentially be able to say, my seller's willing to offer 3% or 4% in concessions. It would be up to me as the buyer's agent to call that listing agent and say, okay, is there room for a commission for the buyer's agent? The listing probably can't say, yeah, if we're offering 4% in concessions, part of it can be used for commission.
As I understand it now, that would be correct. The seller does not have the ability to dictate how those concessions would be used. At the end of the day, one of the things that kind of concerns me as a broker is how that negotiation goes on and how does that impact our consumer, our client, right? We got to be careful to not let our compensation get in the way of a transaction and so forth. But yeah, we're going to see some of those concessions, and you're going to run into lending guidelines as well, right?
I was going to get into that.
And
Yeah.
you're gonna run into what side of the settlement statement do these things show up on, right? Take the VA buyer. Think about they can't pay their professional services fee, right? But you negotiate in your contract that says the seller is going to pay the buyer's agent X number of percentage or whatever. What side of that settlement statement does that compensation fall on? Is it the buyer paying it? And if it's at the buyer side and they're a VA lender or VA loan, that can't happen, right? It's going to have to so there's a lot of moving parts yet.
Yeah, and as of today, and I say that I don't even know what the date is, but as of today, because this is a very fluid situation. If the buyer is agreeing to pay me my compensation out of their closing costs, it cannot be part of the loan. They cannot finance a buyer's agent's commission as of today.
As I understand, lending guidelines prohibit the inclusion of those fees in most cases. Yes, of the buyer broker fees. Yeah.
So over the years, I don't know what has been a more misunderstood, threatening document agents are afraid to use, and I can't speak for other states, so I don't know whether other states have this 3-day cure notice, but I know here in Arizona, agents have just been very weary of it. But the second document is the buyer-broker agreement. And according to NAR, again, I'm just reading it straight from their letter, NAR has agreed to enact a new rule that would require MLS participants working with buyers to enter into written agreements with their buyers, hence the buyer-broker agreement. What is the buyer-broker agreement?
Yeah, well, in Arizona, we have the exclusive buyer-broker representation agreement. We've had that for a long, long time, and you're right, agents have been reluctant or somewhat not willing to bring that in front of their clients. This new rule, if it goes into effect, is going to require that of all of us that participate in the MLS, which I anticipate pretty much everybody will. So that's going to happen, and I think it's a good thing for the industry. I really do. I think we should have an employment agreement with our client and how we get compensated. Look, none of us are going to work for free, right? And so we got to, and buyers are going to have to understand that they are going to have another point to negotiate with their seller when they go to purchase a home.
Yeah, and my recommendation to agents, I'm not fearful of this. I'm not fearful of the buyer-broker agreement. There's a lot of fear-mongering going on
Correct.
social media. 600,000 real estate agents are going to be out of business. But my advice to agents, if you don't become competent and confident in negotiating the buyer-broker agreement, there's a good chance you might be out of business unless you're just getting listings dropping out of the sky for you.
Yeah, well, I don't know of anybody that's doing that. So, but you're right. I mean, that's just part of the change that we're all going to have to adapt to. And no longer are we going to have the ability to rely on the MLS for buyer broker compensation. So,
all right, and as I mentioned at the beginning, you are my designated broker. So you've got a gist of how Ryan and I operate.
I do.
And how we think. And we have a saying on our team, you either pivot or you perish. And so we have been, and we are having conversations of what are the workarounds? How do if I'm representing a buyer, I do not know if there is a co-broke on the table because it can't be listed in the MLS. What are the workarounds? How do we negotiate this? What advice do you have for us as far as being careful? Mm-hmm. And as a broker, and sorry, not sorry, you're my broker.
There's a special place in heaven for me, Michael. I got to tell you that. First of all, I despise the word workaround.
Okay,
right?
Fair enough.
We're in this position as an industry because of some of the practices that we've had for many, many years. And so I think we have to acknowledge the fact that the legal system, at least, doesn't approve of the way we've been compensated as buyers agents and brokers in the past. So that being said, we're not really looking for workarounds. We're working to how to adapt and how do we,
Right.
how do we change our business practices to comply with what the courts are wanting us to do. So what do I recommend? First of all, I think one of the best practices you could start doing is having a buyer intake consultation right at the very beginning before you ever work with, just like you do with a listing presentation. When you go out there, you have this intake process, this consultation that you have. And I think you're going to start seeing that that's going to be very necessary with buyers. And sometimes that's going to happen when they call you off your sign, and they want to come see a listing, and you say, well, we got to have this consultation first. And I know that maybe doesn't sit well, but that's part of some of the changes that we're going to have. From the standpoint of compensation, you're going to have to be comfortable in negotiating not only what value you're providing, but also how you're going to get compensated for that. So it'll work itself.
Well, I want to be clear. I know you don't like the term workaround. So I guess where I'm getting at that is we have to create processes and systems in which we reach out and have communication with the listing agent to determine if there's compensation on the table. And then, and then my concern is are we in trouble if we put something, we write, I'm not going to say in trouble. I mean, this is, and I know you may not even know the answer to this question. That's okay. So if I submit an offer on behalf of my buyer, we've always, at least here in Arizona, we've always been trained that you never put any mention of compensation on a contract. But at our brokerage, we have a form that we send over, have broker sign, and so forth. Is that, in your opinion, is that going to be permissible, or is that just too soon to tell?
So first of all, the idea that commissions couldn't be negotiated in a purchase contract is a wives' tale. I know our industry has held that for a long time, but if you look at other aspects of our industry, like the commercial world, commissions are in contracts all the time and they're negotiated. So can that happen? Yes. Will it start happening in the residential world? Yes, I believe it will. I also believe that there'll be additional forms between brokerages that when the agents have that communication about is there a co-broke available, if the answer is yes to that, there's going to be a form that the brokerages is going to have to sign as part of that process until before that client gets involved with that property from a showing perspective. So I see some of those as changes. I was talking to our office today as to how are we going to implement something like that going forward so that you as an agent out there on the street and you got a client that wants to go see a house, you've talked to the listing agent, the agent says, yes, there's a co-broker offered. Okay, we got to get something signed between our brokers. How do we do that? We've got to figure that out, and other brokerages are going to have to figure that out too.
Throughout, I've been in real estate for 22 years, and I've seen a lot of changes. And when big changes do happen, not all agents make it, right?
Yep.
But there's never been anything that's the end of the world. I think this is not the end of the world for us as real estate agents and for our industry. We just have to pay attention, be prepared to adapt and evolve.
No doubt. Yeah. It's so true that, on a national level, there's 4 to 6 million residential transactions every year. Buyer on one side, seller on the other side.
And I do 25% of them.
You do? Good for you. Where's all that documents at?
Well, that's another conversation for another day.
But at the end, those transactions are still going to happen. Buyers are still going to want to buy, sellers are still going to want to sell, and they're mostly all going to want representation of some sort, right? How that's going to get paid for is another question, but at the end of the day, we just have to adapt to how that buyer side transaction or gets paid for that representation on the transaction. And it's not the end of the world. Will there be some attrition in our industry? Absolutely. But I can almost assure you that for every one that goes out, there's probably 1.5 wanting to come in.
Yeah.
So we're still going to have, plenty of practitioners.
I probably should have added this disclaimer when we first started. There's a lot of agents who are going to watch this and participate in our academy that are not part of our brokerage. You are simply the designated broker for West USA Realty. You don't speak for other agents and their brokers. Don't rely on what you read on Facebook. Go to your broker and find out what their policies and what their broker is saying.
Absolutely. Every time you have one of these things, you have to go to your broker and have a conversation with what their policies and procedures are going to be. We cannot work together to have the same policies between brokerages. We can't collude.
All right, Duane Fouts, designated broker, West USA Realty. Thank you so much for spending some time with us today.
Well, I hope you found it beneficial.